Good morning and welcome to my presentation about Cold War cryptography in West Germany. And let me start my presentation with a question. This question is not about the Cold War, but about World War II. It should be not very difficult to answer it. Well, as you all know, the British in World War II had their code-breaking authority in Bletchley Park. There was a similar unit in Arlington Hall, Virginia, in the USA. And now the question is, where was the German equivalent? Does anybody know the answer? Well, basically there are two answers to this question. Well, question number one, there was no equivalent. And answer number two, well, there were about a dozen different equivalents. And as Sandy already mentioned, there were farms?
Two.
Two?
A big answer two.
Answer two, okay, yes. It's a matter of interpretation, but basically there were about a dozen different cipher or cryptology units. Sandy, you mentioned six important ones or bigger ones and a lot of smaller ones. And I'm not really sure that there might have been even more, but I think the problem becomes clear. In Germany, in the Second World War, there was no central crypto authority, and that was, of course, a major mistake. Let's now proceed to the Cold War time. In 1949, two German states were founded. Well, of course, there was West Germany, with Bonn being the capital. West Germany was a Western democracy under the protection of the US Americans. And East Germany was a communist country with Berlin or East Berlin being the capital. Both countries founded a cipher or crypto authority around, in the early 50s. The Eastern German one was named the Zentrales Chiffrierorgan, or the Central Cipher Unit. This is not the important one for us in this talk today. And the West German one was named Zentralstelle für das Chiffrierwesen, Central Authority of Cipher Affairs, CFCH. And it's important to note that both authorities carried the term central in their name. And why central? Because they wanted to avoid the mistake that was made in World War II to have many different ones. In this case, there should only be one central authority. Well, probably the most important person in the Western German Cipher Authority, the CFCH, was Otto Leiberich. Otto Leiberich was a mathematician. He became a member of the CFCH right after the foundation in 1953. Well, actually, this authority existed a few years before 1953, but the official foundation was in 1953, and this is when Otto Leiberich started. And in 1972, he became the director of this authority until 1990, when the Cold War was over. So he was there for almost the whole time, and I had the pleasure to interview him a couple of times, and he told me a lot of interesting stuff about the history of the CFCH. And of course I took notes, but he also told me many things off the record, and he didn't want me to take notes, so many things I'm going to tell you today are out of my memory. But anyway, it was always a pleasure to meet him, but he died in 2015. Well, of course, when this Western German authority started, the Enigma was an important topic. The CFCH used the Enigma as a transitional and as a fallback solution, simply because nothing else was available in the first few years. The last Enigma was officially put out of service in 1957. Which doesn't mean that it was actually used until 1957, but it's pretty clear that after 1957 it was not used anymore because it was officially put out of service. So it can be said, in general, the Enigma didn't play an important role in West Germany after the Second World War. At least the Enigma, as you see it here, because one of the major questions in the first few years was, shall we build a new Enigma? And in fact, a new Enigma was built. This is how it looked like. This is rotor cipher machine built by a company named TNN. As you see here, it has 15 rotors, so it was a pretty advanced rotor machine, but I don't know how it works. So I think the details are either still classified or at least they have never been published. Would have been interesting. It would be interesting to know how this machine worked. It was certainly pretty advanced, or one of the most complex rotor cipher machines. But it never went to serial production because the CFCH didn't want to use it. Instead, the question, shall we build a new Enigma, was answered with no. Instead, Otto Leiderich and his colleagues preferred the one-time pad. And the one-time pad is the basic reason why no new Enigma was built in the 1950s in West Germany. Well, I'm sure most of you know how the one-time pad works. I'm going to show you a pretty simple version of it, a manual version of it, which was used by West German spies. This method is named Dein Star, which means something like your starring, but the meaning is not really the important part. The interesting about these two words is simply that they contain the 8 most frequent letters of the German language. And this was used as a kind of password for the people who used it. These two words, Dein Star, are written into the second line of this table. And now this table can be used to turn text into a sequence of numbers. And this is done as follows. If you want to replace the E, we take a 1, because the 1 is just above the E. The X is here. This is replaced by 55, and so on. And I think you see the nice thing about this substitution table is that the more frequent letters are replaced with 1-digit numbers, and only the less frequent ones with a 2-digit number. So this is not exclusive to post-World War cryptography in Germany. I think it also was used in Eastern Europe. And this is not an encryption algorithm, but it's just a way of coding a message in numbers. And now this message can be encrypted with the one-time pad. One-time pad simply means we have a key, which consists of a sequence of random numbers. And now the key and the message are added digit by digit. So this is pretty simple, and this is how a spy did it in the 1950s. There were similar variants named Eichstrand and Steinrad. Again, it's not about the meaning of these words, but it's just that they contain the most frequent letters of the German language. Well, it's pretty clear that using the one-time pad this way is very slow, and it's certainly not suited to encrypt large amounts of text. So what was necessary? A machine. So the CFCH had to construct a machine for using the one-time pad. These one-time pad machines were named Mischer, which means mixer in Germany, simply because the message is mixed with the key. And in the 1950s, there were quite a few mixer or Mischer machines around. The first one, these machines usually use punched tapes as the key. And the first machine that was built by the CFCH in the 1950s, or even starting in the late 1940s, was the so-called Mehlen-Mischer. Mehlen is the borough of Bonn, where the CFCH had its seat. And it's a teletype encryptor. It's a pretty simple device, not necessarily one of the best one-time pad machines, but it was built by the CFCH themselves, so they didn't have support from any industry companies. They only built 30 copies of this machine, and then later mixers or later Mischer machines were produced by the industry. For example, the one you see here, this is a Siemens one-time pad device. It's certainly a lot more advanced than the Mehlen-Mischer, and there were other companies like Lorenz or like Philips who produced similar devices. One question the CFCH had to answer was, well, how could German ships or somewhere on the oceans in the world, German merchant ships, how could they communicate with their home base in Germany in the case of war or in the case of some severe crisis? So some encrypted message channel was necessary. And of course, there were a couple of companies trying to sell their cipher machines, and they thought, well, we are going to sell a cipher machine to every ship, and for safety reasons, every ship should have two machines, one as a fallback, and so they wanted to make a lot of money. But it turned out that Otto Leiberich, at least that's what he told me, said, no, we don't want to buy machines for this purpose. Well, first of all, machines are expensive, and second, if a machine isn't used for 10 years and then it is needed suddenly, chances are that it doesn't work anymore. And so he said, instead of buying these expensive and unreliable machines, why don't we use a manual one-time pad? So finally, Otto Leiberich and his colleagues developed a method which simply consisted of an envelope which was placed in the safe of the ship and was only accessible for the captain of the ship, and in the case of a war or of a crisis, the captain would take this envelope from the safe, open it, and this envelope contained a piece of paper with a one-time pad key, and all the captain, it also contains some instructions, of course, and all the captain needed to do is write his message onto this form and add the key, and this was it. And now he could send this message via radio to his home base in Germany, and this was certainly a little cheaper than having one or even two machines aboard. So as you see, the one-time pad was really popular in Germany in the 1950s. There was a very similar system used by the NATO, the so-called ACP 212. I don't have a better picture of it. It was also used in Germany, and it was used for communication with merchant ships, so exactly the same as what I showed on the last slide. Well, Otto Leiberich told me that he was the inventor of this envelope one-time pad scheme, but the NATO also used it, so I'm not sure whether the NATO copied it from Otto Leiberich or if Otto Leiberich copied it from the NATO, and he doesn't remember anymore where he got it from, but at least it seemed to be a good idea, so it was used by the Germans and by the whole NATO. This is a document I found. It says that 1,500 copies of this machine or device were used by SHAPE, which is the NATO, more or less, and all these Navy forces also used it. Germany is not on this list for the simple reason because Germany only had an army in, I think, 1955, and then joined the NATO. So this list was obviously made when Germany didn't have a navy yet, but later they got one, and they also used this scheme. But as you can see here, it was quite was used a lot in the NATO in the 1950s. Well, it is clear if one uses the one-time pad, one needs a lot of random numbers and random letters, and this is why the CFCH had to construct random number generators. I will show you a pretty simple one. This one is called Violine, which would be violin in English. And it's pretty simple wooden device. There's also a plastic version of it. And there's actually another plastic version of it, which I built myself. Lego bricks. Well, if you remember my last talk 2 years ago, I used a lot more Lego models. This time I'm going to only to use 2 of them. But I think it's perfectly suited to explain how it works. Pretty simple, just you have these chips or coins or however you call them. By random, you distribute them to these 5 chambers, and then the device is tilted, so all the chips will slide to the other side, and this is what you get in the end. And all you need to do now is copy the numbers, and this is the random number that is now used as a one-time pad key, for example, for the Dane star method or something else. This is another copy of the same device. Well, it's pretty clear that this worked well, but the amount of random numbers that can be generated this way is not very high. So the CFCH had to look for something more productive, and they came up pretty early, already in 1950, with a Hazardo random number generator based on diode noise. I don't know much about this device, so the details are still classified as it seems. But it was probably suited to produce high amounts of random numbers, and these were urgently needed for all these one-time pad methods. The CFCH also constructed a pocket-size random number generator, which is, I think, a quite interesting device. It's called the Shiva, which means slide shifter. This is how it looks like. Well, there are many Shivas around in collections or museums, and sometimes they are called cipher slides, which is not correct, because you probably know these cipher slides, which are also available as toys, where you simply have these slides. It works like a cipher. It basically realizes a Caesar cipher, but this is not the case here. The Shiva looks similar, but it works completely differently. The purpose of the Shiva is to produce a random number sequence using this stencil. And again, I built the Lego model of it. And as you see here, one special thing about these slides is that all four faces of it are used. So not only the top face, but the other faces too. And now it's pretty obvious how this was used. Well, first of all, you needed a collection of slides. In this case, we have 8, and dependent on the key, in this case, only 4 are used. Then the order of the slides is also dependent on the key. Then, as I said, each slide has 4 faces, so which face is up is also a part of the key. And now the stencil, or actually the slides are put into the stencil, and now each slide is moved, which is also dependent on the key. And this is what we finally get. So the random numbers, or in this case random letters are W, R, F, and so on. And the encryption is simply adding the clear text and the key. So this method was used in the 1950s, but well, as you can see here, the number of random letters is pretty small compared to the work you need to do when you configure this device. And I talked to several people who worked with the Shiva, and all of them said they hated it because it was so complicated. So they avoided to use it, and sometimes when they had to use it, they just said, well, now I will send it in the clear, but assume that it was something important, assume that it was encrypted. Well, the original one has 25 slides, and the number of random numbers is about 15. Here, well, earlier this year I published this Shiva challenge. So on my blog, I published a message encrypted with the Shiva and with the simple version of the Shiva. And within only a few hours, a reader found the solution. So obviously, this small version of the Shiva that I constructed here with Lego is certainly too small. It's too easy to break. And honestly, I don't think that the original with the 25 slides has ever been examined by an expert, at least not in public. So if you're looking for an interesting research project which has some mathematical background, this would certainly be a nice idea. Okay, let me give you a few quotes of Otto Leibovich, for example, about the Enigma. He said, in the 1970s, we heard that in World War II the Enigma had been broken. We were shocked. We had been completely clueless. Interesting to know. Some of our colleagues had already worked for German crypto units before 1945. They were especially shocked. And what did he say about asymmetric cryptography, which was invented in the 1970s? He said, when in the 1970s a coworker told me about asymmetric cryptography, I thought this man must be crazy. The same key is needed for encryption and decryption. This seemed to me as clear as the fact that the shortest connection between 2 points is a straight line. Okay, so he obviously was wrong, or maybe there's even a short connection between 2 points. You never know. Well, so far I've mainly talked about one-time pad and random numbers, but of course the Germans also used other machines because the one-time pad proved to be too complex and too slow. For example, this Hagelin machine, which was very popular in the 1950s, was also used by the Germans, but the Germans didn't trust Hagelin, obviously, so they built their own version, which is completely compatible and very similar, but it was produced by a German company named Hell in Kiel, northern Germany. The same is true for this machine here, a very popular Hagelin machine from 1957. CD57, the German, produced it in license, a company Hell in Kiel. It was called STG-1, and of course the Germans also used the KL7 NATO rotor machine. Well, of course I asked Otto Leibrich also about cryptanalysis, and he said, well, many believe that after World War II, military and intelligence code breaking lost importance. This is far from true. So I asked him, well, can you tell me a case where code was broken in the Cold War? And he said, well, I'm not authorized to But that's at least one case that has become public, a very interesting case. It started in the 1950s. Well, of course, the code breakers at CFCH had to analyze a lot of messages from Eastern Germany that were intercepted, and in 1956 they encountered this one. It's not the original is still classified, but it's clear that there was a message on February 1, 1956, and another message to the same recipient on October 6, and another message on April 8, 1957. And well, it turned out that these messages were encrypted with the double column transposition, the double cube or Doppelwürfel. And if you want to know more about this method, just ask George. He's the world's leading expert on this method. He has broken a number of very interesting messages that are encrypted in this key. And as it seems, the Germans were pretty good at breaking this system too, because they could break it and they could read the messages. And well, the content was quite interesting. The first one in birthday greetings, the second one contained birthday greetings, and the third one, congratulations on the birth of your son. Well, very interesting, but it didn't help much. So for about 15 years, these messages were not really relevant, but it changed in the early 1970s. In the early 1970s, Willy Brandt was the German chancellor, and he had a personal secretary, this shadow man named Günther Guillaume. And well, in the early 1970s, there was a routine control of old encrypted messages, and then somebody in the German Secret Service found out, well, if we look at these 3 messages, which are already 15 years old, it turned out that February 1 was Guillaume's birthday. And it also turned out that October 6 was the birthday of Guillaume's wife. And on April 8, 1957, Guillaume's son was born. So this really didn't look like a coincidence. And this is why the Secret Service started an investigation of Günther Guillaume. And well, it took quite a long time, but finally it turned out that Günther Guillaume was an East German spy, and that these 3 messages were actually sent to Guillaume and his wife. And so after 15 years, this was a great code-breaking success, because this spy could finally be arrested. And this espionage affair was the reason why Willy Brandt retreated in 1974, I think. So it was the end of his career as the chancellor, because of code-breaking success. Well, what else did Otto Leiberich tell me about British cryptologists? This is very interesting. He said our British colleagues were always a little arrogant. They wanted us to know that they had broken the Enigma. He didn't say that they thought that the Germans were stupid, but this is probably what he meant. For this reason, I always begrudged our British colleagues that they were the real inventors of our system. Well, about the Falkland Wars, cryptology played a key role in the Falkland War. I didn't know that, so as it seems, this has never been published in detail. But when in 1982 the Argentinians occupied the British Falkland Islands, the British cryptologists were completely unprepared because Argentina had never been an enemy of the British. But the Germans could help. They begged us to help them. And finally, in fact, we had broken a few Argentinian codes, which was of great help for the British. So I'm pretty sure that the Falkland War is pretty interesting from a cryptologic point of view, and I'm looking forward to learning more about this war and the cryptology that played a role in the near future. So far, most is still classified, but maybe in a few years we will have a talk here about cryptology in the Falklands War, and I will look forward to this one. Okay, before I come to the last slide, let me mention that the things I'm telling here are also available in this book I wrote. It's only available in German, and it's not available in bookstores. But if you want to have it, it's pretty easy. I can tell you how I can get it. Just write an email to the company that produced it or I wrote it for. They usually give it away for free. So just tell them that you listened to my talk and that was great. That they will be happy to send you a copy. At least that's what I hope. Okay, this is my last slide. I asked Otto Leiberich, what was the highlight of your career? Well, he said, I will never forget our first meeting with our East German colleagues after the Berlin Wall had come down in 1990. For decades, they had been our enemies. Now we sat at the same table. Thank you.